be having a simple session called Budget Basics, and I hope that I'll be able to convey some key concepts and also kind of hold your attention. You can see on your screen a chart that is showing the kind of expenditure that the government of India has been making. So the government of India has been making some kinds of expenditure right from 2000, 2001 to 2023, 24. And you can actually see the trajectory of this particular expenditure. On the left-hand side, you can see the amount in lakh crores. On the right-hand side, you can see it as a percentage of the GDP. So the Indian economy back in 2000, 2001 was 20 lakh crore, as big as 20 lakh crores. And today our economy is 295 lakh crores, almost $3 trillion. And when we look at this kind of phenomenal growth, it boils down to a very simple concept that the central government has actually been spending so much. So from 3.3 lakh crores, way back in 2000, 2001, that amount has risen almost 15 times to 45 lakh crores, which approximately is 32,150 rupees per Indian. That's 1.4 billion of us. So basically, the government is trying to improve the citizens' quality of life by public funds being spent across various sectors such as defense, security, agriculture, health, social welfare, education, and infrastructure. So that, at the very least, is the amazing size and the importance of this entire activity. So let's dive into what is the union budget, how to analyze the union budget, and what are some of the focus areas that you guys could think about. So part one would be the union budget: what, when, how, and why. So as I am sure that the very basic you are familiar with, it's an annual financial statement. It's like a very comprehensive report. It's by the government of India regarding its revenues and its expenditures for the upcoming fiscal year. And the fiscal year in India, of course, is 1st April to 31st March. So this particular report or this proposal in terms of what's the estimated revenue and what's the estimated expenditure is tabled before the two houses of parliament. And this is all under the mandate of Article 112 of the Constitution of India. The budget primarily has got two components. One is called the revenue budget, which is the day-to-day expenses that the government is planning to undertake in the upcoming financial year. And the other, of course, is the capital budget, which is like the long-term investments that will add to the ability of the economy to generate a stream of income in the future. So you do know that on the 1st of February each year is when the budget is presented. And because this was the election year, it broke into two parts. We already saw the interim budget before the election, and now we shall find the full budget being released after the election results. So our Finance Minister, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, will be presenting the Union Budget of 2024-25 on 23rd July 2024. And the budget session will run from 22nd July to 12th August 2024. Some interesting trivia coming up. So let me ask you, has it always been 1st February that the budget has been presented? If you can just maybe answer in the chat. Has the budget always been presented in February, on the 1st of February? Yes, I see Soumya saying yes. Okay, that's yes for so okay, no. So Tanay says no. Arvind says no. So after no, there should be something about the no, right, guys? No is not enough. So what about it? So when? Earlier it used to be end of February. Awesome. So Dhruv is on point. Kota says 1st Feb. Arvind says only this year. Nishant is right. Awesome. So I do see some answers coming in correctly. Thank you so much, guys. So yes, you're right. It wasn't always the 1st of February. In fact, it's a very old British tradition to have the budget presented on the last working day of February. Okay? And that's what we have actually always had. It used to be presented at 5 p.m. on the last working day of Feb. And then it was Yashwant Sinha who has changed the timing first to 11 a.m. And then Finance Minister Arun Jaitley in 2017 changed it to 1st Feb. a good heads up for the implementation of the budget from 1st April. And earlier we used to have the railway budget separate from the union budget, and that went on for 92 years. And again in 2017, there was a break away from tradition, and the railway budget is now along with the union budget. Can I ask you guys, why was the railway budget consolidated with the main budget? Why have this? Why did we stop keeping the railway budget separate to the main budget? Any ideas? Anything that comes to your mind. So why now not have a separate railway budget? Better efficiency to consolidate infrastructure efforts. Good, Suthi, Laksh, Shivansh says railway privatization. Insha says to give more realistic fiscal scenario. Awesome, good. So we do know that over the years, thank you guys, you can stop, thank you. So we know that over the years, the railway has lost, it doesn't play the kind of central role it did, because now we have had other infrastructure coming in. We have now this whole concept of logistics. We have the private sector also into it. So it made more sense to look at the infrastructure of railway along with all the other means of transport. That made better sense to also look at the financing. So all the finances towards transportation, and then under the umbrella of transportation, what's happening to the railways, right? So then the other interesting trivia is the first budget of independent India was obviously launched only, was declared only for 7.5 months period, because it was announced on 15th August. So it ran till 31st March. Moving ahead. So that was the what of the union budget, right? So let's look at the how. So obviously, if it's such a humongous exercise, it's looking at this huge country of ours, it's looking at all these departments and ministries. So it does emerge from a series of discussions, meetings and consultations between various departments of the government and other stakeholders. And basically, this entire series of discussions are centered around very important thing, that is the growth driver of the economy. So we're trying to kind of project where our economy is going. What are these important aspects of our economy that could leapfrog us to a higher future, a higher growth? And then what is the government, whatever are the priorities of the government, and then respectively the ministries and whatever funding they need. So it's an entire exercise to look at what's the amount of money we need to push the economy forward and to meet our aspirations. So basically this is the process of the budget. So as you will see very soon on 23rd, that the union budget will be presented and there will be a discussion. So basically what happens is that this is the most visible part. We do see this as citizens because we have a lot of excitement in the country. We have all this update in our newspapers. So this is the part that we do see. But basically, once you see the budget in the form that you see in the newspapers, it ultimately becomes something called a demand for grants. So it's like the government, represented by the finance minister, is requesting the parliament to release grants. So then it's actually a demand for grants per ministry. So then these demands for grants are looked into in a deeper sense. Okay. So let me throw in one more trivia for you. Do you know what has been the quantum of funds allocated to defense in our last budget? Either you can tell me the amount or what percentage did defense form in the entire budget of 2023-24. 8%, 3%, 3%, 70 million, $70 billion. Okay, awesome. Good answers, I mean. So I can see 12%. Arvind says, okay, 70,000 crores. Dhruv says, awesome. So I mean, I like that you are like, estimating. Okay, so Nivita says 13%. Awesome. Thank you guys. I really like how active you are. Thank you so much. So basically, the amount of funds allocated to defense in our last budget was 5.9 lakh crores. Okay, and this amount forms about 13% of the entire budget, the last year's budget. Also, do look at all the other important ministries, okay, and the kind of place they occupy in our economy and the expenditure of the government. The last budget was 45 lakh crores in size, and the 23-24 budget was 7.5% more than the previous budget. So the previous was something like 41-42 lakh crores. And so year by year, we actually are allocating higher amounts to our, passion for the growth and the vision that we have for India in the international scenario. So going back, once we see the visible aspect of the finance minister presenting the budget, it actually becomes a demand for grants, and these demands are presented before the parliament. But because the parliament, every member of parliament doesn't have the patience or the wherewithal to go through all these details, so it goes to some standing committees. So we actually have 24 standing committees, and they now scrutinize all these demands for grants. And how do they scrutinize? They look at the amount that is allocated to programs and schemes under each ministry. They also look at how disciplined and how efficient these ministries have been in the past in terms of utilizing their funds well. Have they had unutilized funds, idle funds lying around? They also look at the scheme and the design of the outcomes. Do they have clarity as to outcomes were achieved or not? And then, of course, they want to look at whether this money being asked and the scheme being created is in alignment with the priorities of that ministry. So here's an example for you that this is the standing committee scrutiny of two aspects in the last budget 2023-24. So it's made some comments upon how there is a high demand for jobs under this Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and it requires more allocation. It has recommended that more number of days of guaranteed work should be offered. It has also commented on how some other programs of the government had huge amounts of unspent balances. Okay, so it's named them. In the latter part, you can see that it has also commented on Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Gramin, the rural part of the housing development scheme that the government has got, saying that the assistance is insufficient, that the houses could not be completed within the stipulated or the budgeted time, the estimated time, because of rising cost of construction, and the amounts were not released in time. So this is the kind of role that the standing committee plays. Moving ahead, so when you're seeing that these demands are made for grants and the standing committees then do their assessment, then there is a discussion. So then now you have a discussion in the parliament. However, sometimes it has so happened in the past that barely any discussion has happened, or twice no discussion has happened and the budget has been passed. So when a budget is passed without any discussion, it is called a guillotine budget, or it's been guillotined. So you can see pictorially that there have been two instances when the entire budget has been passed with no discussion with the parliament. I'm sure you guys are curious. You have all the information at your fingertips. You can go and see how that actually transpired. But that's another interesting aspect, that actually there has to be a detailed discussion, there has to be voting and things like that. So they first begin with the major chunky ministries and this in-depth discussion, and then the rest of the ministries, en masse, they are voted upon. So what if the demand for grant is approved? Does it mean that the government does not need any additional funding? Yes or no? Do you think the governments or the ministries stick to these allocated amounts? So if additional funding is required, what's to be done? Okay, no, good, Sudhir, Parth, Simran, Tarang, nope. So bonds are issued, I can see supplementary grants. Okay, awesome. Treasury bonds. Okay, so if the government goes for these kinds of borrowings, so again, the mechanism of raising it is a different story, but it still has to be approved by the parliament. Okay, good guys. Thank you so much for interacting. So if additional funding is required during the fiscal year, then it becomes an issue of a supplementary demand for grants. Okay, but when the government makes these kinds of supplementary demands, that means what? The previous budget was approved, and now 1st April started. As the year is running, let's say in November, December or Jan, the government now needs more funds before the close of this financial year. Then it has to submit a supplementary demand for grants, but this time round it doesn't go to the standing committees and it's cleared without scrutiny. So again, last year we have seen that 2 supplementary demands were made and a total of 1.4 lakh crores were raised by the government, and this was equal to 3% of the budget. So basically, the government has asked, so the smaller amount, the government has asked for additional funds for subsidies. So subsidies towards food and subsidies towards fertilizer. So now, going ahead, does it mean that this is all? Is this the end of this entire activity of the budget? What follows after this? Any clue? So what's up next? There is a fiscal deficit. So we are saying that no. So the expenditure is approved and the appropriation is released. So the parliament says, okay, TK, you have your funds, and the funds are allocated. So that becomes the money bill, becomes the finance bill. The finance bill is passed. So आगे क्या है? Is this the end of it all? Whom does the government ask for? Again, parliament only. So there's an evaluation. Very good. Aditya Verma says evaluation. How much was generated and used? Quota says perfect. So it's not just that the government asks for money or the departments are asking for money. There's always an evaluation also. Very good, guys. So when we talk about the evaluation, therefore the budget is important. That on the one hand, we do have this issue of estimating what's coming in the future, what kind of money coming in, what kind of money going out. So there is a good scrutiny, and then there is sanctioning of funds for government expenditure and taxation proposals and things like that. But the other aspect of it is that there will be an auditing of the utilization of funds. So for that, we will have the Comptroller and Auditor General. It will present its report to the Public Accounts Committee. So again, we can't expect our members of parliament to do all the dirty work of reading all these long documents. So we have the PAC, and then the PAC looks into all the details of how the allocated funds were utilized. Okay, so that's like the closure. And can you now see how important therefore the budget is? So let's have a look at one of the PAC reports. So the last year we had the PAC. It's 151st report, and the comment particularly was on Ayushman Bharat and Pradhan Mantri Jan Arogya Yojana, so the one that's taken care of health. Okay, so the committee examined and found that this PMJAY, its objective is affordability, accessibility, and quality of secondary and tertiary healthcare for the poor and vulnerable sections of the population. So can you see how they even present the data? They say, if this is your objective, we find that there are inadequacies in the process of identifying the beneficiaries and verifying the beneficiaries. They also found duplication and also the inclusion of ineligible beneficiaries. Okay. Then they also found that there was a large backlog of pending claims, because there was poor bank integration and offline payments were not, that facility was not there. There was a lot of delay. So in this manner, the PAC will then comment upon how the funds were used or how the scheme was implemented, having given the funds, right? So that's the kind of role that the entire budget exercise is all about. So therefore, I hope that you can understand that it's an important activity. It helps us to understand where the rupee is coming from. It helps us to understand where the rupee is going. It lets us know what are the budget allocations to these ministries and departments, different government programs and schemes, right? It gives us a very good view of the revenue and the expenditure of the government, not just for that particular year, but incrementally year after year also we can kind of track, right? And because we keep tracking, sometimes we see that more money is given like consecutively for a couple of years, sometimes it drops. But then we also get a very good view as to exactly where is the government focusing on. What does the government believe to be the the pivot that will take the economy forward, right? So what are the priorities of the government? And of course, at the end of the day, you and I are citizens, so we always want to come back and look at the impact on us. So whatever are the tax announcements, how prices are being affected, how government is supporting public services, so we get impacted, right? So at the end of the day, the union budget is important because it plays an important role in shaping the country's economic growth, economic development, and of course, all kinds of social welfare initiatives. So I hope you guys had some clarity about the first aspect. Can I move ahead? Yeah, I can see somebody on top saying, "Ma'am, can we have this PPT?" Of course, anything for the students. This was made for you guys only. No, no issues. I shall release it. So I'm going ahead. So we move to the second part and the interesting part. How do you analyze the union budget, right? So basically, we really want to look at where is the rupee coming from, which means what all are the sources of income for the government, and where is the rupee going. So what all are the expenses and expenditures that the government of India is taking upon itself, because it wants to do a good job for the citizens, for the different ministries, for the different sectors, and then for the nation in comparison to our place in the world, right? So basically, when you have the budget announcements, you will always have this picture. It will be given very clearly. So if we are accounting for 1 rupee, that is 100 paisa. So then we get a clear view as to this income of the government comes from which sources. So you can see from personal income and corporate tax together, they form 30% of the income of the government, right? GST forms about 17% of the government's income. And then the government also borrows, like I could see earlier when I was asking you about supplementary, grants or demand for grants. Then the government can borrow internally, and that's where it will raise treasury bills, issue bonds. So RBI does it on behalf of the government. So 34% of the government's income is coming from borrowings. Money is coming from borrowings. Okay. Now, so here we are saying that there are some. So the money coming in will have different aspects to it. So we have the revenue receipts, which will be tax. We have the revenue receipts, which are non-tax. So when we say revenue, we mean short term, right? For 1 year. And when we say capital, we mean long term. So now in the revenue tax receipts, we have, of course, income tax, that is from the individuals and from the corporations, right? We have the GST, which is of course levied on the manufacture, sale and consumption of goods and services. And the government in the interim budget has announced an 11.6% increase in GST. Okay, even the government's income tax collections have been very high. There's been a 13% increase in the income tax collection that the government has received, and that is the reason why it has got a healthier fiscal deficit. Then, of course, customs duties are levied on goods that are imported to India. And then, although the government is trying to, have better relations and a better, international trade, and it wants to boost domestic manufacturing and reduce import dependency, it has to balance all its political ambitions also, right? It's international diplomacy as well. But basically, the customs duty collections are expected to be stable. Then, of course, you have excise duties, which are levied on the production of goods within the country, right? And then again, we've been rather generous. We want to bring in, these big chunky MNCs to come to India and do their manufacturing out here. And so it has, despite reducing, it has been a significant source of revenue for the government. Then, of course, we have non-tax revenue receipts, which basically will be the interest receipts, right? So when states are borrowing, when union territories are borrowing, when, other entities like municipal corporations are borrowing, then they pay interest. That is what we meant that earlier when we looked at borrowing. So all the entities that have borrowed money from the government of India via its bank, that is the RBI, when they pay interest, that's the revenue that the government of India earns. So for this interim budget, the announcement was some 12,504 crores coming in as interest receipts. And basically, it's 40% of the revenue receipts. So the per year income that the government earns, 40% of it is interest receipts, right? Then, of course, another very big support to the government of India has been the public sector. So all the Navratans, all the good public sector companies, and again the RBI, so they pay dividends to the government of India, and that becomes a substantial contribution to the government's kitty. Then, of course, as you and I, as citizens, we live our lives. If we ever have, broken traffic rules, or you want to use toll booths, or, what have you, so you will have some revenue collected by the regulatory bodies, right? So any examination fees you pay, any police receipts, penalties, and things like that. So that also becomes an income for the government. And of course, then you have the capital receipts. So when the government is selling some assets, selling some public sector companies. So can I ask you guys the difference between disinvestment and divestment? What is the difference between disinvestment and divestment? So so both are basically selling assets. So disinvestment is selling PSU, selling some part of the government owned is disinvestment. Very good. Very good. So when we say selling its assets, basically we are saying it's selling the entire company, the entire factory, the entire business is divestment. Okay, it's completely selling off. Disinvestment means it is decreasing its investment. That's all. That's the difference. So somebody has put the opposite in fact on top. So disinvestment is selling partly. So you are allowing other shareholders. So you sell your shares to other shareholders and you decrease your holding. That's disinvestment. So what we know as, calling in private parties to also buy a part of the public sector company. But divestment means selling it off completely. So I can see some of you given the right answers. Good, thank you. Moving ahead. Also the government will raise money internally from the market, T-bills and bonds. And of course, the government can borrow from abroad. And you can see that the government debt is pretty humongous. And that has been a sticky point for us because we were in trouble. We have taken loans. I think by now we all understand the kind of manipulative loans that developing countries ultimately get stuck with. So we have loans to Asian Development Bank. We have to World Bank and things like that, right? So that was all about money coming in. Now, what about rupee going out? So where is the government spending, right? So here the government has got some interest payments, okay? Some pension to be paid, some subsidies, defense expenditure. So again, if it's 1 rupee, then 20% is interest payments the government has to make to external bodies, okay? I'm so sorry. The previous point was actually the revenue coming in. I'm sorry. Okay, so this is if the government has given to other bodies and then the government receives it. Please, I'm sorry, this point. This is receipts, money coming in. Okay, here we have where the government has borrowed and the government has to pay. So here you have any duties, then you have central government schemes, you have any other transfers, things like that. And of course, the big fat, issue here is the defense budget. So now here again, you will have long term and you'll have short term. So whenever you have any expenses that bring a change to the government's assets or liabilities, then they are called capital expenditure. And everything else that you're paying for short term running of the government, running of the country, that becomes revenue expenditure. Now, under capital expenditure, the government will spend a lot of money to build infrastructure, right? So spending money for roads, railways, urban development, right? And then this has been like a major theme with Modi 2.0 and now going ahead Modi 3.0 also, where in fact in the interim budget an 11 lakh crore allocation has been made for infrastructure and almost 17% increase. So I want to ask you guys, is it a good idea when the government is investing in the infrastructure? So for those of you who understand the GDP equation, so we have G. Other than G, what else do we have? So is it always the government that should be paying for infrastructure? Okay, it pays for itself in the long run. Very good, Harshil. It's a good idea. The consumer, okay. It's for economic development. Okay, banks are paying for it. Okay, to help overall growth. Okay, awesome. Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, it's an investment for the future. Yash, awesome. So yes, so because this public infrastructure is so huge, right? And it won't give returns upfront. So that is the kind of capital expenditure that private enterprise doesn't like to get into. So then it makes sense for the government to be a part of it. Now, the controversy that we are now talking about is why is the government taking the entire load, right? Because we have had a successful history of PPP. So what we want to now look at is why is it that the private sector seems to be missing. So we have had a healthy history of public-private partnership. So that is one of the things that, we would like to reflect on, that it would have been nice if this load that the government has taken on would be at least shared to some extent by private sector. Okay. Then of course, good, bad, ugly, whatever it is, the government makes some commitments to its public sector enterprises. I am personally not happy to see this. So BSNL got an allocation of 82,916 crores in the last interim budget. And so this kind of capital infusion the government will make in public sector enterprises. Okay. So sometimes it might not be the very, very best use of money, but there is some vision that the government has regarding certain public sector enterprises playing some kind of role. Then, of course, again, an important point, because nobody else will come forward for this, the government does invest in health and education infrastructure, particularly building new schools, hospitals, and, taking care of, really building and really bolstering higher education institutions. Then, of course, the new kid in town, a lot of investments for green energy. So we are, backing the whole sustainability agenda. And then we have been quite strongly focused towards solar, energy and, wind energy. Then, of course, there is a lot of buzz about EV. And again, these are technologies that still have to, at least EV, it's still up in the air, and we have to look at how that will pan out, right? Did any one of you read the newspaper today and yesterday? Today and yesterday, in terms of what has Rajiv Bajaj said about EV? There was some comment he made. Yes, Economic Times, yes. Yes, Keshav. So what did Rajiv Bajaj say about EV? In fact, I think it was one interview, because the previous day also there was a comment, and today also there's a comment. And I think yesterday's paper, I don't know if I'm right, he made a very interesting comment. He said that when something will happen, the monkeys will exit the circus. That's a comment that Rajiv Bajaj has made. So what did he mean by that? So I'm giving an incomplete sentence, Keshav. I'm saying that if something happens, the monkeys will leave the circus, is what he said. Fire incident. Okay, good guess, Gautam. EV profitability. Think again. So is EV profitable? Who is driving EV? What's really driving EV in India? Private sector. So the new entrepreneurs, subsidies. Awesome. So Laksh has hit the issue on the head. Subsidies. So there is a lot of government support and subsidies without that kind of profitability and sustainability. In fact, that same story is playing out in the West. Okay, so there are some insolvencies happening in the West also, in terms of EV companies surviving without government support or subsidies. Awesome, guys. Thank you. So moving ahead, so what we just had a look at was whenever there's a change in government's assets and liabilities. Now we are looking at revenue expenditure. Okay, so we are looking at whatever the government has to pay for that particular year to maintain and keep the wheels of the economy running for that particular year. So of course, one big thing would be the interest payments on the, so per year the government has to pay something on the borrowings, and that becomes a huge amount. It's almost 1/4. It is 1/4 of the total expenditure that the government needs to make, right? And then of course, this is another big chunky thing, that the government does bring in subsidies for food, fertilizer, petroleum, and so on and so forth. So petroleum has been one sticky thing again for quite some time now, and that amounts to something like 2 lakh crores. Then again, another thing, so people have their divided opinions, and I saw in the comments somebody has rightly put it that pension payout that the government does is pretty high. So it's about 2.39 lakh crores in the interim budget that was announced. And then of course defense, but I think, so let me ask you guys, do you think that the defense expenditure is justified? So we have about 6.2 lakh crores for the salaries, maintenance, operational costs. So I see no from Simran, I see yes from Vandana, Pavitra. Sutir says 2/3. It's less. It's because of border hostility, because of China and Pakistan, because salaries and pensions are high. Okay. Chunk goes to pension, Ukraine. Okay, awesome guys. Thank you. You will get some clarity. We'll move on to another segment where we look at the defense sector itself, and you'll also understand why naturally that amount becomes very high. Of course, we do not live in an ideal world. We would like peace. We would like peace across the globe, but that's just not the reality. And we are trapped with hostile neighbors. So it is justified. Nobody can really ignore defense anymore. But we'll come to that point. Why is it such a high number? Okay, so let's hold your horses for now. Moving ahead. So I hope that you got some good clarity as to one big chunky part of looking at the union budget is just sit down and see where the money is coming from, where the money is going. Once we have done this exercise, we want to look at whether there is a deficit, whether there is a shortfall. Okay, so basically, the fiscal deficit is the difference between the entire total revenue of the government and the entire total expenditure of the government. So this is a number that we do track when we want to look at whether the government's balance sheet is healthy, right? So whenever the government spending exceeds the government earnings, then we have a fiscal deficit. And then, of course, the shortfall is made up. Either the government can borrow internally, externally, or the government can print more money, or the government can use some saved funds, which this has been working for us because the RBI has been giving money to the government in very healthy amounts, right? So there is something important in India. We have the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. So under this act, every government, no matter who leads the government, no matter which party, they are bound by parliament to keep the fiscal deficit low. Okay, so again, even our finance minister did recognize that they would like to bring down the fiscal deficit to 4.5 by 2025-26. Okay, so as of now, the amount till a couple of days ago, we were told it is 5.8, the fiscal deficit, but we were happy to know that the RBI has actually given a huge dividend to the government, and so it has come down to 5.1%. So the fiscal deficit is this all of the revenue and all of the expenditure net, right? Revenue deficit would be that whatever is the revenue expenditure over revenue receipt for this particular year of all the money in a rolling running system. When money is coming in, money is going out, that deficit will be tracked. That itself also is, there is a gap of 2%. So above, we understand that government has got old loans, government has borrowed, and India has moved ahead because of its past. But even now, after being such a big economy, after having such a healthy private sector, after having like a very dynamic economy, we are actually not able to even cover our per year expenses, right? So the government is also borrowing in a sense to put food on the table. You and I will not do that, right? We won't borrow money to put food on the table. Maybe we might borrow to buy a financial asset, which will then return money to pay off the loan, right? So that's not a very good state to be in. So these are the numbers that we do track. And then that's the second thing that you look at, whether there's a fiscal deficit or not. Then further ahead, another thing that you can do is you can analyze the union budget in terms of looking at the ministry allocations, in terms of looking at the policy announcements, because then the government again takes a lot of interest in certain, important sectors and the kind of priorities they have. Another thing that we can do, of course, is compare the current budget with the prior budget. But of course, there's always a revision in terms of what ultimately was the amount that was spent that particular year. Can I ask you guys that before the budget is announced, is there any important document that is released by the government before the budget is announced? Economic survey, awesome, Sutir. So did we have the economic survey this time? No. What did we have instead of the economic survey when the interim budget was announced? Population survey, no. But good, you guys are really brilliant actually. You don't need any basic budget session. Data by Niti Aayog. Okay, but which data? So the government has given us the government has given us a report of the last 10 years, not NFH's data. So the government has given a report about what all were their achievements in the last 10 years. So we are hoping that before the budget is announced, we can hopefully see the economic survey. Okay. So we want to see what is the state of the economy, right? So I heard somebody say that, please can you explain the previous slide? So we actually have an act that was passed in 2003. It requires that the central government should slowly reduce its outstanding debt. Okay. So whether it has a debt over the entire amount coming in, going out, which means it includes long term. So fiscal will include revenue and capital. Okay. Money coming in, money going out. It should reduce that, and it should also reduce the revenue deficit. That means only that per year money coming in, money going out. So by act of parliament, every government is committed to keep the debt low. Okay. So now if you're already in a debt system, you can't suddenly come out of it, right? So year by year, some targets are kept for the government to keep decreasing its debt. So this mismatch between, that means what? It should increase its income or it should decrease its expenditure, right? That's the idea. So basically, this particular government, this particular year, we were thinking that when we are closing this 23-24, there's going to be a fiscal budget deficit of 5.8. But recently, the RBI has declared one more time 2.21 lakh crore. And that is narrowing the fiscal deficit to 5.1. So earlier also the RBI has given income tax revenue has been high this time. Even GST collection has been high this time. So the government has been cozy. Because actually the government is spending a lot. The government has been spending a lot. But it has been lucky that it was always also able to garner funds. Yet, despite getting all this bonanza money coming in, there is currently a deficit of 5.1%. Okay, and that is what we are saying, that there is a fiscal deficit of 5.1%, and the next year they have to reduce it further and further, so that by the time it's 25, so this coming year, so by the next year they are bound to report to Parliament that it came down to 4.5. So ideally we want it to be 3%. That's the idea. Okay. So I hope it was helpful to whoever has. So the primary deficit is basically saying that it's your fiscal deficit, removing the interest payments. Okay. So that means you have even the main loan, but you are removing the interest payments that you are making to the outside parties, right? So that also is 1.5% of the GDP. So we really have to increase our revenue coming in and reduce our even year by year expenses. So again, we move ahead, you will see one point coming in. Can I go ahead, guys? That's a very good question. Is a debt-free economy good for the nation? Good point. We'll discuss. I really don't know how much time we have, but at the end of it all. But again, I'll take some questions and then maybe send the answers. We'll see. So going ahead, we are still looking at how to analyze the budget. So we said, look at the money coming in, look at the money going out, look at the deficit, okay? And then we moved on to look at the allocations and the policy. You can compare each budget to see where is the heart of the government, where is the focus of the government, right? So again, in all your budget documents, that's the beauty of the world that we live in. If you want to know something, it's actually quite easy to self-learn, right? So anyway, here is one image for you. It shows you that you can actually look at scheme-wise. So if you can see that this Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, there was an increase of 49%. Okay. And then again, you can also see this Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana, right? Sinchai, I think. So that's when we read Hindi, was it English? I'm so sorry. So that would be, when they're plowing, if I'm not wrong. So that again got an increased allocation of about 30%, right? And then can you see Gram Sadak Yojana had less allocation. So then again, if you're tracking it year on year, you also get to know where is the focus of the government, where money is actually being pumped, right? So that, in a nutshell, is how you analyze the union budget. You look at the money coming in, you look at the money going out, you look at the growth in this, you look at the deficit between the two, you look at these different ministries getting stronger, getting weaker, commanding an important position, because they are bearing the shoulder, that they're shouldering the responsibility of bringing in economic growth to the country, right? So at one point of time, we had agriculture doing really well, right? And a lot of support that came in for manufacturing. But very quickly, we have pivoted to services, right? And then agri is a little weak. So then this is how, again, we also track how certain ministries, come into fruition, and then certain support they get by schemes and policy announcements. Of course, one thing we do like to track, of course, is taxation rates and the overall taxation policy. There's a lot of buzz nowadays that there should be a wealth tax, but that's a discussion for another day. And of course, you can always compare budget to year budgets and see even like a long-term positioning of how the economy is changing its nature and shape, right? So let's move to the third part. So the third part is basically saying that let's look at some focus areas or some key themes, right? So first, of course, is agriculture. We have certain strengths. We have a very diverse agro-climatic zone. So we have this potential of really, doing well. We do have a good range of crops as well. Agriculture has always been the focus of every government, for that matter, actually. Then we have some policies that are doing really well. So we have the PM Kisan Yojana, we have the Fasal Bima Yojana, so we have quite a lot of focus on agriculture. And then now, interestingly, because that's the one thing that we really have to give the Modi government brownie points for, it's very linked into the global aspirations, right? So we are talking about looking at post-harvest activities. So not just agriculture, but the entire supply chain, right? So to aggregate the crops together, to store them, to have a proper supply chain, and then the marketing of it. In fact, this morning I was just having a look at Economic Times, and there was some picture about Sitaraman and some kind of cold supply chain that they have started, and they're looking to buy onions and keep them. So buy onions at a certain good reasonable rate, and then keep them in storage, and then set them abroad. So they're always ideating on how to kind of modernize the entire supply chain, right? And then, of course, a lot of focus on aquaculture and its productivity. There's also this ambition to double seafood exports. India has been quite strong in seafood exports for quite some years now, right? However, there are some challenges in agriculture. We have a large population that, depends on it. A little controversial, because actually, if we talk to people in the agri sector, they in fact don't have enough hands. We see a lot of migration, a lot of people coming off to the city. And when they genuinely have a demand, they don't actually have the kind of manpower. So something controversial happening out there. We need more data to understand how this has changed in India. But still, a big chunk, at least, is linked to the agricultural sector, right? We also saw our blue-collar workers going back home because they knew that they would have food. They do have fields. But at the end of the day, most of the agri activity in India is small. It is fragmented. We don't have a large size, farms. Therefore, economies of scale becomes a big problem, and the efficiency has been low. Crop yield also has been low, right? We do have inadequate infrastructure. We don't have the implements. It's not modernized. A lot of our farmers cannot afford basic machinery, or they don't know how to operate it. And if they manage to buy it, they don't maintain it. They don't have the funds to maintain it. Then, of course, the big pain point is that we have stayed vulnerable to monsoon. We haven't been able to really connect all parts of India and have a proper irrigation system. And now the new, pressure coming in from climate change and the kind of vagaries of weather that we are seeing right now, right? Then, of course, now the new pressure in terms of, we should have food security within, or should we take it as an opportunity to earn export earnings? And then we did have the government put its foot down and say that no, Indian citizens and their demand for rice, wheat, sugar, and onions is more important than exporting it and earning money, right? So these kinds of dilemmas and hard spaces continue to, baffle the whole kind of, policy making in agriculture. So what do we really urgently need is we do need proper irrigation facilities. We need better access to markets through a better infrastructure. We need, better implementation of digital platforms such as ENAM. We would like our farmers to move to sustainable farming practices. We don't like stubble burning that we see in Delhi, and that creates a lot of pollution also. Then of course, although we had the PM Kisan Yojana, and they have a policy of paying some 6,000 rupees per year, but that has stayed static for almost 5 years. And then there's been inflation, so it needs to actually be inflation adjusted and increase those allocations. And it can also be probably expanded to people who don't own the land but are laborers or they are tenants on and they do the tilling of the land. Then of course, looking at the next one, and this is what I was talking about earlier. So defense, again, it's actually one of the biggest strengths of defense industry in India is this, that we have one of the largest standing armies in the world. And therefore, to maintain it is a big expense. We have a huge army in numbers. So we have a lot of manpower in army. And then of course, like somebody was saying, it's a lot of pension, it's a lot of payments also. That's true, but we have a huge army. We also have nuclear capability. It probably acts as a deterrent to our neighbors. We more or less have a reasonably modernized, indigenized, robust infrastructure of defense. This particular sector receives a lot of funds, not just for procurement, but also for research. So that's good, some in good strengths. But the challenges really are that we still remain dependent on imports for critical defense technologies. And a lot of time procurement is delayed. And in certain aspects, some equipment has been aging. Not everything is modernized or updated. There's always a constraint in the budget because we are a developing economy and there is only so much budget to allocate, right? So of course, other economies allocate much more for defense, and we feel that 13% is high, but it still probably is less. So what do we need? We really do need advanced technology, particularly looking at the sad state of affairs in the geopolitical tensions. It is a no-brainer now. And we do need to reduce our reliance on imports. And so the one aspect is that Make in India should be actually encouraged so that we can have more self-reliance and more advanced technology. Of course, the new kid in town nowadays is silicon. So chip manufacture is going to make a big difference in precision targeting and what have you. So that's something that the government is looking at. So moving to the next sector, that is infrastructure. So again, our strengths are we have made significant progress in infrastructure development, particularly roads, railways, urban infrastructure. So can you guys tell me that whether roads, railways, are they true strength of India? Do we have adequate roads in India? Let's forget everything. Roads in India. No. Why no? So where is it lacking? Okay, good guys. You guys are absolutely right. But where are we lacking? Absolutely rural. We still don't have last mile connectivity. A lot of places in India are very rural. In fact, like it is such a challenge. It's not just northeast. So weather resistant roads, perfect. Good guys. So we've kind of solved the issue of highways, but we still don't have connectivity within areas, right? It's been, so we have, corruption, improper material, subpar kind of, improper quality, potholes. Awesome. You guys are active also. Thanks so much. You're absolutely right. So there are some challenges. Although the government is focusing, we have some 3 railway economic corridors also coming in. Government gives a lot of focus and keeps pumping money, and this government has been pumping money. Even the prior government, that's how we had our, prior to the Modi government, we have had our national highways and all. However, it is usually delayed. At least in the last budget, this has been the complaint that the projects are delayed. There is a funding constraints. Money doesn't trickle down. Then of course we have some land acquisition issues and disputes and delays in that. Then therefore we really do need urban infrastructure, right? So urban spaces also need better infrastructure. We need better rural connectivity. And of course, now because we are aspiring to be an active player in global supply chains, so movement of goods and services within the country, from the country, are going to be very important. So logistics. So can I ask you guys, what is your opinion about logistics? So is it a strength of India? In terms of urban infrastructure, we still mean connectivity of telephone lines. We do still mean, digitization. We still do mean maintenance of roads. Potholes are there. So these kinds of, so again, of course, if you guys can remember, the government has been talking about smart cities, right? So we are nowhere there. So then again, um, so like is so I can see IoT thrown in there. So you guys just tell me that what proportion of logistics industry in India is modern? Just throw a number there. So I'm also just creating a question. Actually, I don't have any data on this. 1%, 40%, 60%. So we are saying that on the ground level, at the grassroots level, people are digitized. I can go online. I can. So that's not true. That's not true. So we only have few companies trying to make headways. But if you, as a student, will go down and do research, it's very, very painful. People still sit with books and write down accounts. It's very painful. So there is again that binary. Yes, a lot of manual data, handling. So we are still not half as digital as we need to be. So even I would say 15%, 10%, max 20%, right? So these are the constraints that continue to dog us. But it's good to at least have these in place, that we will look at these aspects, right? Moving ahead, I would actually like to bring in this concept that there's a lot that we need to also focus in terms of the gig economy, right? And although I know that youngsters think of gig economy in a very different manner, as the you will do like a digital business, but in India we're still calling it the informal sector, and then having this dynamic demand, and you can have flexible kind of employment. So that is a rising trend. It has been for some time. We know Amazon dominates. We know e-commerce really took off. We have now Nykaa and what have you, at least in the urban spaces. They're doing reasonably well in three-tier towns also. So that is something that we really need to look at. And a big chunk of our population does belong to the informal sector, something that most people don't tend to talk about, but that is the reality of it. Okay, so we need to look at the gig economy. What are the strengths? That yes, it's growing rapidly for us. It offers, it kind of solves to some extent the employability or employment issue. It has been contributing very well to the Indian economy, some 2.5% contribution. And these are actually old numbers. So this is from my own research, a paper that I had written 2 years ago. So 90 million jobs are created per year by this informal sector, the gig economy. But what are the challenges? Of course, for people working in this sector, they have no job security. There are very unpredictable and inconsistent earnings. They don't have power. People throw whatever salary that they would like to offer to these blue collar workers. There is absolutely no connection to their experience to, and whether somebody is 10th pass, 12th pass, graduate, it's all clubbed together. So they're quite powerless in this particular sector. They really don't have high enough wages. They don't even, so the bare minimum wage also is not something that they often earn. So this livable wage that they aspire to becomes a problem. Then of course they also end up in debt. The other important thing is that if somebody works in this sector, there is absolutely no social security, there's no health insurance. They are literally, vulnerable. Of course, there are no retirement or pension, savings or schemes coming from the employer. And then, of course, a lot of these are not even registered. They're small mom and pop stores. They're very small businesses. So then again, it's very fickle. It's not regulated, right? And of course, so there's a big problem that we don't even have a proper database. We actually have some 411 million people in this particular informal sector, the gig economy, and about 56 million in agriculture, construction, logistics, electrical jobs. And again, we seem to kind of ignore the street vendors, 8 million approximately, 5 million domestic workers. So a couple of years ago, we had some kind of some kind of movement where the domestic workers, demanded some rights in terms of getting Sunday off, getting, some kinds of leaves in the year. And then, of course, on the other hand, we asked that they should have their Aadhaar, and, people should be, recorded at least in the societies and some kind of movement, some kind of formalization. But we tend to ignore them as though they just don't exist in our economy, but they actually form a big chunk of our economy. So therefore, we urgently do need labor reforms. We do need to have like minimum wages enforced, safety conditions in which people work, and of course, some kind of insurance that the employer has to offer. Of course, the other big problem is that a lot of these people are working without any skill development, without any kind of training. It's often on the job kind of training that they have, and we need to formalize the entire sector. Okay, so there's a lot of disturbance that happens. In fact, not just this, a couple of years ago also we had that Manesar incident where they take a lot of these temporary labor. Temporary labor, you don't have to take care of their social security. You don't really have to be reporting about their insurance and things like that. So then some of these companies have also been extending and using only part-time labor for their proper manufacturing. So that's been some kind of problem also, because we do have excess supply of informal labor, right? So let's wrap with some themes that we can actually expect the government to focus on. The Indian economy has grown at 8.2% in the last year, and it's been really phenomenal. But this kind of consumption, this kind of growth has come only at half the rate of consumption. Okay, so can I ask you guys, what is the kind of role that C plays in your GDP equation? So in your GDP equation, you have the consumer, you have the government, you have the private sector, I, and then you have the net of imports and exports, right? So what is the kind of role that consumption plays in any economy? What's the role that they play? Yes, Anshika, you're right, it's consumption, but what is the role? So when we are saying that consumption has increased barely at 4%, right? So they fund for further capital formation. Excellent. So Bhumika, how do they fund for further capital formation? You're absolutely on point. They are the buyers of goods and services. They're spending money multiplier. Consumption will lead to demand. It impacts inflation. Their savings. Yeah, on point, Bhumika. So you're absolutely right. One of the important things that they do is, of course, they bring in the demand. When there is a demand, there is production, right? So they pay for all these services. Now we have GST also they're paying for personal income also, right? And then of course that only becomes profit, and that becomes also corporate income coming in, right? So that's the anchor. So the consumer is the anchor, right? And of course the other very important thing is that when they have savings, and that savings then become the capital formation for the country. So if the government is borrowing from abroad, the point really is to encourage savings in the country. So any concerns that the households are having right now, forget the slide, but from your world, your point of view, what are some of the concerns that households are having currently? Why is consumption low? Inflation, perfect. Fuel prices, very good. Increased tax rates, or rather no decrease in tax rate, very good. Awesome. So but GST is a problem. Electricity, so liquidity is low. High inflation, COVID, so a lot of disruption because of COVID, high vegetable prices. So there's a changing preference. So again, also there has been a culture of spending now suddenly, right? Low salaries, or not that much of a growth in wages and salaries. Very good. So again, you're all right. Good. Thank you so much. Of course, two things happening here. There is inflation. There is so the incomes and wages are not keeping track and growing as fast as inflation is. But also there is a turn towards consumerism. There is a turn towards spending, and when you're doing it in a digital manner, maybe people are not able to account for it. Can I ask you guys, what is RBI saying again and again in terms of households have become vulnerable? If you're reading the newspaper, what is the government saying about stopping what? Yeah, there's a high gap between rich and poor. Very good, Hashim. Um, so digital threats is what the RBI is saying. Very good. So vulnerability towards debt trap. So Soumya is right. So the RBI is trying to actually give a rap to influencers, give a rap to fintech. Why? What is the kind of problem that's being caused because of influencers and fintech in India? That's been like the dominant thing that so credit cards, okay, fraud. Tanisha says fraud. Credit cards, not that much, but they so what is this debt that they're taking? You're right. Um, so if you guys are paying attention, a lot of so not so much cryptocurrency, but FNO, a lot of futures and options kind of trading, and a lot of people are being unnecessarily lured to take risky investments. And there is this buzz that you can make so much money on the stock market. So that is becoming actually a predatory behavior. So people who don't, yes, FNOs are extremely risky. So those who do not understand, they are being pushed, and then they are taking loans. And fintech will give you a loan, right, for XYZ. You don't have, so the way banks are fussy, fintechs are not, right? So very good. You guys have ultimately, and of course, there is misinformation, there is fraud, all that is also there. But all this kind of pressure is coming in, and so the anchor of the Indian economy, that is the household, is being affected, right? So there are some discussions that will the government decrease the personal income tax? Will it rationalize GST? Probably not. There are no signs like that in the upcoming horizon. And we continue to be plagued by issues of tax evasion, a very complex tax structure. It takes a lot, when you have litigation, compliance is all expensive. Whatever other kind of taxpayer services that citizens could benefit from, those are not really there. Thank God, at least it became digital, so that's become really subtle to actually, file our returns. But some kind of pain points. So I'm not even talking about inflation right here. Right now, I'm still talking about what comes inside the budget, right? But not much probability. But it would be something that the government should look at. Of course, the government is focusing on rural economy, but it is falling short. So it has to look at job guarantee schemes, and we know that before the elections, the rural sector was really, really unhappy and disgruntled with the government, right? Then there's also a question of increasing the minimum support price for farmers. Then there's a question of giving more handouts to farmers, because whatever is there currently is not matching inflation. It doesn't cover other people who are also employed in farming. Another interesting thing that we will see, the government is focused on housing. Government is looking at housing in the rural areas. The government is looking at housing in the urban areas for low income. But is there corruption? Is money trickling down? Are those projects delayed? Are funds being sanctioned or not? These are issues. Okay. Another thing that we could focus on is, of course, what we have touched upon earlier, that fiscal deficit is something that the government is bound to. It has to look at these aspects, right? So we are also looking at, it's not just like the center, but also the states have got deficits, right? So the state deficits are also adding some. So there is an imbalanced growth between different states. Some are ahead, some are lagging behind. So together it becomes a very high amount, right? So something like about 7.8 deficit if we include the central budget and the state budgets, right? Then of course we know that this particular government is a coalition government, and then we have two politicians who have supported this government. And so we also heard that they're asking for some kind of special status, but probably the problems that are there in these two states are their own policies that have got them in trouble. But will the government buckle, to pressure by these, coalition partners, and will they end up, having some kind of additional allocation to some schemes and policies and something like that? Then of course, the big issue this government is really taking on the load for capital expenditure, and it actually ends up paying a lot of money for the kind of capital it is raising. And when it's paying money for the old loans, it becomes, as you understand, CIBIL scores also, so it becomes very difficult to actually raise fresh capital. And then this time when actually the private sector should have stepped up, for whatever reasons, private sector has been pretty dull for the past quite a few years, right? And then of course domestic savings have become much lower than what they used to be historically. And at the same time, countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia are doing actually well. And we have ended up competing with them, in fact. And we know that a couple of years ago, Bangladesh also has taken us over for, textile industry and things like that. So it's kind of tragic that at the one end we're a large economy, but we're actually competing with really small sized countries just because they have high efficiency, right? They have high productivity. But in the context of this fiscal deficit, the government will still be committed to these anchors of the economy. It has to again and again wants to look at the poor. It will look at the women, the farmers. The very big pain point right now is high levels of youth unemployment. Skilling is poor. Okay. Government will continue to focus on health and family welfare, but it keeps its budget allocation to less than 2% of the allocation. So that is against the budget. So that is something that we have to see whether it will increase or not. Of course, we are at a very interesting point in global history where now this China plus one policy has come in. Can I ask you guys quickly, what is this China plus one policy? So what is China plus one? Any idea? Okay, another trade partner, two countries for outsourcing, better than China. So a lot of countries, of course, have turned to China for their manufacturing and particularly for some components, right? So yes, so when we look at the global supply chain, China is a very important partner. But then now they're looking at this policy where they don't want to over depend on China. They want other countries coming in and taking on this OEM kind of manufacturing, right? So that is the reason why we have Foxconn in India for iPhone, right? So we manufacture, we assemble on their behalf. So this kind of over dependence on original equipment manufacturers, OEM. So these are the ones that will make the components and assemble on behalf of a MNC client. And yes, absolutely, Thailand is doing very well. Indonesia is doing very well. So we say China plus one, and people do turn to India. But because India's manufacturing sector is weak, it hasn't become a strength of India. So again, these MNCs are looking at other alternatives. So we need to really buckle up. We need to really give a strength to manufacturing. Can you guys tell me any policy? Yes, Taiwan is doing very well. In fact, Taiwan right now is doing very well for one particular manufacturing. What? Which manufacturing is yes, absolutely, semiconductor, and one particular company. Which company? Yes, you guys are all right. Perfect. TSMC. Perfect. TSMC. So TSMC from Taiwan. Can you guys kind of give me a number? What proportion of semiconductor manufacturing is done by TSMC alone in China, in Taiwan? Global chip manufacturing. So Gautam says 90%. I can see 75, 40, 50. It's about 93%, 90, yes, 93, 97. My brain is saying 93. It's been some time that I read. So somewhere between 90, so I'll take in even Rishabh's number. So somewhere around that, it's definitely more than 90. Okay, alone, one company. The last question to you about this aspect: which semiconductors are they manufacturing? And like, so the war between US and China right now is about, yes. So the war right now is high precision. Okay, so we are talking about nano. We're talking about precision surgery. We're talking about space. Because now even space has opened up to private sector, right? Yes, absolutely, nano. So they are like the most sophisticated chips are what Taiwan is actually having an edge for. And the government of India is talking about fabrication of chips and all that, but we are still looking at the chips for cell phones. But actually, the game has gone to precision, medical interventions, spacecraft, military. So like high precision, right? And that is somewhere now we are waking up to that. And even now, so there is no question of us going into sophisticated semiconductors, but there is some kind of aspiration by the government to look at this policy. The other issue coming in is this, groups of countries now supporting each other. So it was very interesting to actually read a couple of days ago that the US is actually having this alliance. Of course, nothing new, but Australia, Canada, UK, where they want to not even have students doing courses on semiconductor manufacturing or any yes, absolutely. We have the Five Eyes group also, very good. So you guys are very well informed. So there is this bizarre attitude that the US has got only because they were completely caught off guard in COVID, that China is so sophisticated in its semiconductor use. Okay, so they are not in the game as Taiwan is, but they're picking up now because now suddenly US has put a hard stop. So when there was an entire COVID clampdown, that's when they realized how very sophisticated the Chinese system already was in facial recognition in the public infrastructure. Okay, so whatever we saw in Mission Impossible, Tom Cruise and me being spotted, that was actually already being implemented in China. So again, so I can see somebody writing that Russia, China, North Korea, they might. So again, so there is a lot of these mini multilateral groupings, right? And yes, of course, there is tension in Taiwan where China wants to take over. The change in guard in Taiwan is also, anti, and they kind of, daring China. So geopolitical tensions continue, right? So again, so AI chips have become, so we heard, right? Apple has announced AI enabled cell phones, right? And they're calling it, what is the full form of this AI for Apple? I think it's called, so they've also called it AI only. So their AI, Apple Intelligence, absolutely, right? So and the kind of crazy increase in the share price of Nvidia, that has also been very impressive. Of course, recently people have been taking profit because of the stock really rose. I don't know what, 500 times or something like that, right? So 5 times, right? So some kind of exuberance for AI. And then, of course, alternative energy will become another important thing going forward. So to close this entire discussion, basically, we do know that the government has made this very clarion call about Amrit Kal. Okay, what do you guys understand as Amrit Kal? What is the government talking about? No, Shadab, there's no insider trading for Nvidia. It is that really they believe because they are in the pocket for the kinds of chips that people are using. That's all. So 100 years of independence. So these 25 years, we should be like so hardworking and do such a good job that from the 75th year to 100th year, we should be in a very different kind of a trajectory. So we should break out of this, India is a developing country, there is Bharat, there is India. So all this. So the government has, it's always good to have like a very clear vision, like a very clear, slogan. But at the same time, we have some clear issues. We really don't know what's the data on the ground level. We still don't have macro pictures being told to us very clearly. So we are still looking for the economic survey, right? Then we basically, private sector has not come forward because there is no stability in the business environment. So we want some kind of stability inside India so that people can take a risk and raise fixed assets, right? Otherwise, we don't want. Why would they want to take a chance by putting up these kinds of huge machines and companies and infrastructure and then be open to some kind of gundaism or things like that, right? And then of course, although it's a good call and all these things are there, but that vision is still not very clear. So we are looking forward to maybe this budget or going forward in the next year, some kind of clarity in terms of exactly what, because at the end of the day, we still have a very large number of unemployed youth, right? Absolutely. You've hit it on point. So I can only say your name is dear IMS student, but where is the census, right? Where is the census? So it's not a very good thing to be blindsided in this manner. These are really important anchors when we are looking at the country, when we are looking at developmental goals and global aspirations, right? So good points. You guys have always raised very good points. I want to ask you one thing now. I know that you are so I really don't know about the recording part. That would be whoever is hosting. That's not at my end. I'm sure that the host will take care of that. I'm sorry, but I don't know about the recording.
Yes, ma'am. We will share the recording. after this session.
Awesome. So one question, you guys, when you guys are participating in this event, how many? So raise a put a yes or no. How many of you are planning to use Chat GPT? Just put a yes or no when you're participating. No, no. So Gautam says no. Piyush says yes. Piyush is the honest one. Pavitra says yes. Siddharth says yes. Mukul says yes. Okay, so finally it's a split this thing. Okay, good. Didn't think about it. Okay, awesome. You do know that we are not saying don't use. I think the word changed. We're not saying don't use AI. It's a tool. You're not going to rely on a calculator for your studies and your career, right? You're not going to rely on a calculator. You're not going to rely on Wikipedia. So they are the same. They are tools. So yes, they are a good. It's a good reference point to start with. Instead of reading reams and reams of information, there's no harm, because that is something we are also teaching our students at SPGen. We are very clear about the kind of skills that we are developing for our students. If our students have to be a part of the modern global workforce, we actually have AI sessions in our college, in our system, right? But you should be able to use it responsibly. You should be able to, you should not plagiarize. You should cite it correctly. So I thought before I leave, I'll give you two inputs. Yeah, so you can always, and of course, you have to learn how to ask questions properly to Chat GPT. You can't just pick up and dump the content in your competition. You have to reflect on it. You have to actually, so we are SP Gen Global, by the way, Roop. We're not SPJ IMR, we are SP Gen Global. Go have a look at the difference. Ashish, I also hate Chat GPT, but it's a good thing. It cuts short my time. So I do use it sometimes on and off, especially when I want to create sums for my classroom. So it quickly gives me like a database, and I want to create some kind of, in-class revision quiz. It's free. ChatGPT is free. So anyway, let's not get caught in this. I will show you two things now. One is that if you are using ChatGPT, you will be thrown out by the software, Turnitin software. So you should learn how to cite when you're using ChatGPT. Use it sparingly. Do not use it left, right, and center. Okay. So I'm just going to show you that whenever you use ChatGPT, do you guys know how to cite AI generated content? Does anybody know? Yeah, so you can use Bard, Gemini, whatever you want, right? No, yes, no. Okay, fine. Okie dokie, fine. So basically, so I'm just giving you an example that if suppose you had told ChatGPT to create a poem for you, okay, and if it created this poem, generative tools of AI we employ to aid us in our academic quest, but citation must be given to avoid the charge of plagiarism and unrest, right? And this is from a Harvard document. So if ChatGPT created a content for you, just as you cite any other material, because normally what we do, we put author and year. So same way you can put OpenAI and year, whichever year you created that content, right? So OpenAI is the company that owns ChatGPT, right? So the same way, if you're using, Llama, so you have to write Meta. So whatever that is, you write accordingly. So this will be in text citation, and then in your reference list, you have to write like this: OpenAI year. Okay, so which particular large language model you have used, its name, which version. Okay, you mention that you have used an LLM, and then you always give the link to your chat with the AI tool. Is there clarity? You guys are clear about how to cite AI material? So you can see it on your screen. So you have to put an in-text citation and reference list citation also. Okay. So I hope there is some kind of clarity. Let me also give you two good websites that you can go to. Please do go to indiabudget.gov.in, and you can go to prsindia.org. In fact, PRS is doing a very good job of reporting a lot of parliamentary proceedings and issues.